women and girls in sporting competitions. I know it's very...
Caitlin Clark just broke her silence, and the 4 words she chose to break it with, "If she goes, I go," have sent the WNBA into the most immediate and the most commercially concentrated institutional crisis the league has ever produced, because those 4 words from that specific person, in that specific institutional context, are not simply an expression of personal loyalty between 2 professional athletes who have become the most publicly documented competitive and personal partnership in women's basketball history. They are a commercial ultimatum of the most specific and the most institutionally direct kind, delivered by the player whose individual commercial ecosystem represents the financial foundation of the commercial relationships that sustain the WNBA's institutional viability in its most commercially significant era. And the massive backlash the league is now facing over Sophie Cunningham's suspension is the institutional expression of every stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem simultaneously processing what it means when Clark says those 4 words, in response to a governance decision that the basketball world has broadly characterized as the most institutionally indefensible single disciplinary action in the league's history. Today I am breaking down exactly what Clark breaking her silence means, why the specific 4 words she chose carry more institutional weight than any press conference statement or official advocacy communication she has made throughout this entire season, what the massive backlash over Cunningham's suspension reveals about where the WNBA's relationship with the fan base and commercial partner community currently stands in the aftermath of the governance decisions we have covered across the most dramatic governance accountability story in women's basketball history, and what happens next in an institutional crisis that has now reached the specific threshold at which the governance apparatus's standard management mechanisms are not adequate to the scale of the commercial and institutional consequences it is facing. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark, I am going to show you the specific institutional calculation behind Clark's "If she goes, I go" statement that every outlet covering the breaking silence is treating as a declaration of personal loyalty, when it is actually the most sophisticated commercial and institutional strategy Clark has deployed in the entire arc of the accountability story, and the one that changes the governance situation from a crisis the management apparatus can absorb to a crisis it genuinely cannot survive without producing the fundamental governance changes the accountability effort has been demanding. The "If she goes, I go" statement arrives at a specific and precisely calculated institutional moment in the Clark era's governance accountability story. Everything this channel has covered across the most dramatic season in women's basketball history has been building the institutional conditions that make those 4 words the most consequential institutional communication in the sport's commercial history. The Cunningham DNA proof ban we covered in detail. The Players Association's formal legal challenge to the ban. The interventions from LeBron James, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, Steph Curry, and Cheryl Miller that we covered in successive videos. The formal legal proceedings the ban triggered. The institutional explosions and eruptions and turmoil that each governance decision produced as its institutional consequence. All of those things together have been building the specific institutional conditions that Clark's "If she goes, I go" statement now activates in their most commercially concentrated form, because the statement arrives in an institutional context where every stakeholder in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem already understands, with complete clarity, what the commercial consequence of Clark going actually means for the WNBA's institutional commercial viability. And the 4 words connect that understood commercial consequence directly to the governance decision about Cunningham in a way that makes the commercial consequence of governance continuation, without fundamental change, the most specific and the most immediately concentrated commercial threat the WNBA's governance apparatus has ever faced. Clark did not break her silence with an advocacy statement or a governance analysis or a commercial threat. She broke it with 4 words that every stakeholder in the basketball world immediately understood were all 3 of those things simultaneously. And the massive backlash the league is facing in the aftermath is the institutional expression of the commercial ecosystem's recognition that those 4 words have created a governance situation with a specific and unavoidable commercial timeline attached to it. Let us start with "What if she goes, I go" actually means as a commercial and institutional statement, because the surface-level reading of the statement as an expression of personal loyalty between Clark and Cunningham while accurate as far as it goes, understates the specific institutional significance of the statement in the governance accountability context in which it has been delivered. Clark has spent this entire season demonstrating through every public communication she has made that the institutional significance of what she chooses to say publicly is calibrated with the specific awareness of her own commercial position and its institutional implications, that only a player who understands the full scope of what her commercial ecosystem means for the governance apparatus's institutional viability can achieve in the specific form the "if she goes, I go" statement represents. She knows what her commercial ecosystem means to the WNBA's commercial relationships. She knows what every broadcast partner, every sponsor, every commercial entity that has built its women's basketball investment around the Clark era's commercial metrics knows about the commercial differential between the WNBA with Clark's full participation and the WNBA without it. She knows that the Cunningham ban is the specific governance decision that her fan base, her commercial partners, and the broader basketball accountability community have most comprehensively characterized as institutionally indefensible. And she knows that 4 words connecting the governance decision about Cunningham to the commercial consequence of her own departure are the most specific and the most commercially concentrated governance accountability statement she can make in the specific institutional context of everything the season has built toward this moment. The "if she goes, I go" statement is not impulsive. It is the most precisely calculated commercial and institutional ultimatum of the Clark era, delivered at the specific moment in the accountability story when the accumulated institutional conditions make it maximally effective as a governance accountability instrument, rather than simply as an expression of personal loyalty. Now let us talk about the massive backlash over Cunningham's suspension that Clark's statement has intensified, because the backlash itself is the institutional consequence that the "if she goes, I go" statement was designed to create and concentrate. And understanding the specific nature of the backlash and why it is more institutionally significant than any previous backlash over any previous governance decision in the Clark era is essential to understanding what the governance apparatus is now facing and why its standard management mechanisms are inadequate to the scale of the institutional crisis Clark's statement has created. The massive backlash over Cunningham's suspension has 3 distinct institutional dimensions that are operating simultaneously and that together create the specific commercial and institutional crisis that the governance apparatus cannot manage through any combination of communications strategy and incremental governance response. The first dimension is the fan base dimension, which is the emotional and commercial reaction of the Clark-era audience whose engagement with the WNBA is most specifically organized around the values and the relationships that Cunningham's suspension violates in the most direct and the most publicly documented way. The fan base backlash is not simply the social media expression of competitive fans who disagree with a disciplinary decision. It is the commercial signal of a fan population whose relationship with the WNBA is conditional on the governance apparatus maintaining the specific institutional values that drew them to the sport in the first place. And Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement has translated that conditional relationship into its most specific commercial form by connecting the fan base's conditional engagement to the most commercially significant individual decision the governance apparatus's conduct has made necessary. The second dimension is the commercial partner dimension, which is the institutional reassessment by every broadcast partner, sponsor, and commercial entity that has invested in the Clark era's commercial proposition of whether the governance apparatus's disciplinary decisions in the Cunningham case are compatible with the commercial proposition they have been building their investments around. Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement has made that reassessment commercially urgent rather than institutionally gradual by creating a specific and immediate commercial timeline attached to the governance decision about Cunningham that every commercial partner's investment calculation now has to account for explicitly. The third dimension is the governance accountability dimension, which is the formal institutional pressure from the Players Association's legal challenge, the outside voice interventions we have covered across multiple previous videos, and now Clark's own direct commercial ultimatum, working simultaneously to create an accountability pressure that the governance apparatus has to respond to in every institutional domain where its relationships with stakeholders in women's basketball's commercial ecosystem are sustained. Now let us talk about why the "if she goes, I go" statement is the most sophisticated commercial and institutional strategy Clark has deployed in the entire accountability story. Because this is the analytically significant layer that the mainstream coverage's loyalty framing is preventing from receiving the attention it most urgently requires. Throughout this season, Clark has been navigating the specific institutional challenge of using her commercial position to create governance accountability pressure on the apparatus that governs her professional life, without crossing the institutional boundary between legitimate commercial advocacy and conduct that the governance apparatus could characterize as a governance violation, subject to the same kind of disciplinary action it deployed against Cunningham's advocacy. Every public statement she has made, every commercial announcement she has executed, every institutional action she has participated in, has been calibrated to that specific navigation challenge, using her commercial position to create maximum governance accountability pressure, while maintaining the specific institutional posture that the governance apparatus's disciplinary authority cannot reach. The "if she goes, I go" statement is the most precisely calibrated execution of that navigation to this point in the accountability story, because it creates the maximum possible commercial accountability pressure on the governance apparatus's disciplinary decision about Cunningham, without taking any institutional action that the governance apparatus could characterize as a disciplinary matter itself. 4 words expressing a conditional personal intention are not an institutional governance violation. They are a commercial signal that the governance apparatus cannot discipline without creating an institutional escalation that would be more commercially damaging than any consequence it could impose on Clark for the statement itself. The sophistication of the statement is the specific form of commercial accountability pressure it creates through the most minimal and the most personally expressed institutional communication that achieves the maximum commercial accountability effect. And that sophistication is what makes the "if she goes, I go" statement the most consequential institutional communication of the entire Clark era, rather than simply the most emotionally resonant. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Clark, breaking her silence with "if she goes, I go" in the context of the massive backlash over Cunningham's suspension is not simply the emotional climax of the most dramatic governance accountability story women's basketball has ever produced. It is the institutional event that activates the full commercial consequence of everything the accountability story has built, and that creates the specific commercial timeline the governance apparatus has been managing to avoid throughout the entire season's accumulation of institutional pressure. The timeline the "if she goes, I go" statement creates is the most commercially specific and the most institutionally unavoidable deadline any governance accountability effort has imposed on any professional sports governance apparatus in the modern era of evidence-based governance accountability. Because the commercial consequence of Clark going is not a future risk that the governance apparatus can manage by demonstrating improvement over time. It is the specific and immediate commercial reality of the WNBA operating without the player whose individual commercial ecosystem represents the financial foundation of the commercial relationships that sustain the league's institutional viability in its most commercially significant era. And the "if she goes, I go" statement has connected that immediate commercial reality to the governance decision about Cunningham in a way that gives the governance apparatus a specific and unavoidable institutional choice, rather than the continued possibility of incremental management that every previous accountability pressure has allowed. The governance apparatus can maintain the Cunningham suspension and face the commercial consequence of Clark going, or it can reverse the Cunningham suspension and face the institutional consequence of having formally acknowledged that the accountability pressure created by Clark's commercial position is sufficient to override the governance apparatus's disciplinary authority in specific situations. Neither option is comfortable. Neither option is the kind of managed outcome the governance apparatus has been producing in response to every previous accountability pressure. And neither option is available to the governance apparatus without producing a specific and formally documented institutional consequence that changes the governance situation for the Clark era and for every future governance situation in professional women's basketball. Remember the institutional calculation detail? The specific institutional calculation behind "if she goes, I go" is not simply the loyalty calculation the mainstream coverage is reading as the statement's primary content. It is the commercial and institutional calculation that identifies the Cunningham suspension as the specific governance decision at which the commercial consequence of Clark going is most specifically and most credibly attachable to a single institutional action in a way that creates the unavoidable institutional choice the governance apparatus has been managing to avoid throughout the entire season's accountability story. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement, and the massive backlash it has intensified, and why together they represent the most commercially concentrated and the most institutionally unavoidable crisis the WNBA's governance apparatus has ever faced. The specific commercial timeline the "if she goes, I go" statement has created is not simply a threat whose resolution can be managed by the governance apparatus through the standard combination of communication strategy and incremental governance response. It is a formal commercial and institutional ultimatum whose specific conditions connect directly to a governance decision that the accountability effort has established as the most institutionally indefensible single disciplinary action in the WNBA's history. And the combination of the ultimatum's commercial specificity and the governance decision's institutional indefensibility creates a crisis that the governance apparatus cannot resolve through any response that does not directly and specifically engage with the Cunningham suspension's institutional adequacy. The governance apparatus's ability to manage this crisis through anything less than a direct and specific engagement with the Cunningham suspension has been eliminated by the specific form of Clark's statement. And the massive backlash that the statement has intensified is the commercial ecosystem's recognition that the governance apparatus's standard management mechanisms are not adequate to the specific crisis the "if she goes, I go" statement has created. The second hidden angle that nobody in the mainstream coverage is adequately examining is the specific institutional consequence of the "if she goes, I go" statement for every commercial partner whose women's basketball investment calculation now has to formally account for the specific commercial timeline the statement has created. Every broadcast partner, every sponsor, every commercial entity that has invested in the Clark era's commercial proposition on the assumption that Clark's participation in the WNBA is the durable foundation of their investment is now evaluating that assumption against the specific commercial timeline the Boers' "if she goes, I go" statement has imposed. And the institutional consequences of that evaluation for the governance apparatus's commercial relationships are the most directly consequential dimension of the crisis that Clark's statement has created. My verdict on Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement and the massive backlash over Cunningham's suspension is this, stated without any hedging. Caitlin Clark breaking her silence with "if she goes, I go," and the WNBA facing massive backlash over Sophie Cunningham's suspension represents the most commercially concentrated and the most institutionally unavoidable governance crisis in the history of professional women's sports. Created by the most precisely calibrated commercial and institutional ultimatum that any player has ever deployed in any professional sports governance accountability situation, delivered at the specific institutional moment when the accumulated conditions of the most dramatic governance accountability story in women's basketball history make the 4 words "maximally" effective as both a personal statement of loyalty and a commercial and institutional ultimatum that the governance apparatus cannot resolve without producing the fundamental governance changes the entire season has been building toward as its most consequential institutional destination. The first reason this verdict is correct is the commercial precision of the ultimatum. "If she goes, I go" creates the most specific and the most commercially concentrated governance accountability pressure the governance apparatus has ever faced by connecting the most commercially indefensible governance decision to the most commercially consequential individual departure threat in the most minimal and the most personally expressed institutional form that achieves the maximum commercial accountability effect. The second reason is the institutional unavoidability of the choice the statement creates. The governance apparatus cannot continue managing the Cunningham suspension with the incremental response mechanisms it has been applying to every previous accountability pressure, because the "if she goes, I go" statement has created a specific and unavoidable institutional choice that those mechanisms are not designed to address. And the unavoidability of the choice is what makes the "if she goes, I go" statement the most institutionally consequential communication of the entire Clark era. The third reason is the massive backlash it has intensified. The backlash over Cunningham's suspension that Clark's statement has intensified is not simply a social media reaction that the governance apparatus can manage through communication strategy. It is the commercial ecosystem's recognition that the governance situation has reached the specific threshold at which the standard management mechanisms are not adequate to the institutional crisis Clark's statement has created. And that recognition is what makes the backlash the most commercially significant institutional reaction to a governance decision in the WNBA's history. The strongest counter-argument is that "if she goes, I go" is ultimately a personal statement of loyalty whose institutional and commercial implications are being overstated by the governance accountability framing, and that the governance apparatus can manage the specific commercial and institutional pressure the statement creates. Through the same combination of communication strategy and incremental governance response it has applied to every previous accountability pressure, without producing the fundamental governance changes the analysis suggests the statement makes unavoidable. That argument has genuine merit as a management optimism defense. The counter to the counter is that the specific combination of the statement's commercial precision, the Cunningham suspension's institutional indefensibility, the accumulated accountability pressure of the entire season's governance story, and the specific commercial timeline the statement creates together produce an institutional crisis that is qualitatively different from every previous governance crisis the management apparatus has successfully contained. And the qualitative difference is what makes the "if she goes, I go" statement the institutional event that changes the governance situation from a crisis the management apparatus can absorb to a crisis it genuinely cannot survive without producing fundamental governance changes. So tell me in the comments right now, do you think Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement will produce the specific governance response that reverses Cunningham's suspension? Or do you think the governance apparatus will find a way to manage the commercial and institutional pressure of the statement without producing the direct and specific engagement with the Cunningham suspension's institutional adequacy that the "if she goes, I go" statement most directly demands? Drop your answer, because this question is the most commercially and institutionally urgent governance question in professional women's basketball right now. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction. The WNBA governance apparatus announces a formal review of the Cunningham suspension within 24 hours of Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement, specifically acknowledging the institutional indefensibility of the suspension's relationship to the underlying conduct it addressed, and committing to a formal process for determining whether the suspension meets the governance standards the collective bargaining agreement requires. And the announcement is immediately analyzed by every institutional stakeholder as the most direct available signal that the governance apparatus has recognized that the commercial and institutional pressure of the "if she goes, I go" statement has created the specific institutional threshold at which managing the suspension through the standard incremental mechanisms is no longer viable. High confidence, because the specific combination of the commercial precision of Clark's statement and the institutional indefensibility of the Cunningham suspension creates a governance crisis whose resolution through any mechanism other than a direct and formal engagement with the suspension's institutional adequacy produces more institutional damage than the formal review itself, and the governance apparatus's institutional survival calculation makes the formal review announcement the minimum adequate governance response within the timeline Clark's statement has created. Second prediction, every major commercial partner in the WNBA's broadcast and sponsorship ecosystem makes a formal or informal communication to the governance apparatus within 48 hours of Clark's statement that specifically references the "if she goes, I go" commercial timeline in the context of their own investment calculations. Creating the most concentrated single-week commercial accountability pressure the governance apparatus has ever received from its commercial partner community, and producing formal institutional discussions about the commercial governance of the Cunningham suspension situation at the ownership level of the WNBA's institutional structure. Medium confidence because commercial partner communications of this kind are genuinely difficult to predict in their specific form and timing, even when the commercial logic of some form of engagement with the governance situation is clear. But the specific commercial timeline Clark's statement has created makes commercial partner engagement with the governance situation more urgently necessary than any previous accountability pressure has made it. Third prediction, and this is the bold one. Clark's "if she goes, I go" statement produces the complete reversal of Cunningham's suspension within 72 hours, accompanied by the formal institutional acknowledgement that the governance apparatus made the most institutionally indefensible single disciplinary decision in the WNBA's history and the specific governance framework reforms that the entire season's accountability story has been demanding. Marking the "if she goes, I go" statement as the specific institutional communication that the most consequential governance accountability story in professional women's basketball history needed as its resolving moment to produce the fundamental institutional changes the Clark era has required. Low confidence on the specific timeline and the specific completeness of the governance framework reforms, because institutional governance processes move at their own pace and involve deliberations that cannot be predicted with confidence. But the commercial and institutional precision of Clark's statement creates conditions for resolution at a speed that no previous accountability pressure in the Clark era has been able to generate. Remember the institutional calculation detail? The sophistication of the "if she goes, I go" statement is that it is simultaneously the most personal and the most commercial and the most institutionally precise communication Clark could make at this specific moment. And the combination of those three dimensions in 4 words is what makes it the most consequential single institutional communication the Clark era has produced.